I'm Denise, I'm the Scottish one.
And she's a non-fiction editor. And I'm Louise, the English one.
And she's a fiction editor. And together,
we're the Editing Podcast. Hello and welcome to the Editing Podcast. So Denise, tell everyone what we're talking about this week.
Hello, Louise. So this week, we're delighted to welcome a guest editor and writer, Brunella Costagliola, who is a specialist in military writing.
Yes, welcome, Brunella. So tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you do for a living and where you live?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Denise and Louise, for having me on your amazing podcast, which I listen to religiously from the United States of America.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. You're very welcome here.
Well, I was born and raised in Naples, southern Italy, and after living in several countries, including England, actually, I lived in nearby Cambridge. I then moved to the United States of America following my American husband, who's in the military. He's in the Air Force. And we are currently stationed in the state of New York. And I guess after graduating with my bachelor's degree in English language and Japanese language and culture, I then moved to the Netherlands and I studied at Leiden University there. And I actually graduated there with 2 master's degrees, one in American history and the other one in English language. And after graduating with 2 master's degrees from Leiden, which, by the way, gave me the incredible honor of calling Nelson Mandela, Albert Einstein, and many other greats of history my fellow alumni.
Wow. One thing is just crossing my mind here. You're very well traveled and you're very well educated.
I then moved to Cambridge to be with my then fiance, now husband, who was stationed in England. So I decided, well, I love English language and I want to teach it as a second language. So I got a certificate in English language teaching to adults from Cambridge University. And I began teaching in Cambridge. I was very happy with where my career was going. And on the same day that the director at the school I was teaching at told me and offered me an amazing contract, I went back home with my great news. I told my military fiance, and he said, well, I have news too. The military is sending us to the Netherlands. So military life happened, and I declined the amazing offer. I moved to the Netherlands with at that point, my husband. And long story short, that's how I got into writing and editing. I was out of a job, and my husband one day suggested, hey, you love writing. Why don't you start writing as a hobby? So I said, oh, that's a good idea. And I began writing and publishing several articles on topics that really I felt passionate about online. And then one day, the right person just happened to read my articles, contacted me, and offered me my very first, what I consider to be serious ghostwriting project. I wrote a memoir for a lady who lived in Los Angeles. She flew me there. I lived with her for a period of time. And that was my very first ghostwriting job. Eventually, through word of mouth, I received more and more job offers. And here we are, almost 8 years later. I am an award-winning author, best-selling editor, and I work for some of the most important, prestigious, and successful publishing companies here in the United States of America, including HarperCollins, Brown Books Publishing Group, and publishing firms such as Kevin Anderson and Associates. But because of my passion for the publishing industry, which just happened to, I guess, everything fell into place thanks to the military life, even though if you had asked at that time, are you happy that you had to stop your teaching career because of the military? I would have said no. Looking back now, that's 2020, and I can tell that that was what had to happen in order for me to pursue my true passion, which is writing and editing. So given my passion for the publishing industry and given that I live and breathe military life, I decided to combine my two worlds, and I launched the very first and only writing and editing services agency catering exclusively to military authors and military related manuscripts. And my company is called the Military Editor Agency, which is an LLC now.
That's lovely, the way you took your life experience and your career experience and developed, not I mean, you were sort of nudged into doing it. You kind of had to, you were forced to make changes that weren't initially your choice, and you turned them into major positives.
Thank you so much. I guess when it comes to military life, this is what we have to do, especially as spouses. We have to adapt, and we have to make do with what we have. And because of that, I just saw there's such untapped potential in the military community. And I also saw that the publishing industry wasn't necessarily aware of it. So I wanted to bridge that gap between the military community and all this untapped potential and bring it to the forefront of the publishing industry with all the contacts that I have in that world.
And it's a great specialism.
Yeah, it's such a perfect niche that you seem to have found yourself, well, not created for yourself really with your experience. Brunella, could I start off by asking you then, what in your opinion makes a really good military book?
I think it definitely depends on the genre, but as far as I can tell, when it comes to nonfiction, so let's talk about memoirs, for example, what makes a really good military book is the author must be sincere, honest. The author must put themselves in a vulnerable place. Do
you think that's, sorry to interrupt, I'm just curious, when you say about putting themselves in a vulnerable place, do you think that comes, that doesn't come easily to people with a military background?
That is very difficult for many authors. That is what I experienced the most is, unfortunately, they have to put themselves mentally and emotionally in a place that would require them to relive some of the most, potentially the most dramatic moments and tragic moments of their lives when they in war, or perhaps their best friend being killed on the front line. It's very challenging, but unless my authors want readers to feel the worst story in their gut, they have to be honest with it, and they have to be okay with becoming vulnerable. But I always tell them that there is something I witness with every one of my author. At the end of the writing process, they take the deepest breath, and it's almost as if they have simply put all of that weight that they have been carrying around for years onto paper, translated work, put it onto paper, and now it's almost as if they had that pain has left their mind and their heart.
It's a therapeutic process. Wow.
Very, very therapeutic. Yes, and it's beautiful to witness as an editor or a writing coach. It's beautiful to witness that. It really is. And I think something else that makes a really good military book is you need to, from a more technical point of view, from a more editorial point of view, you want your story to be read by a wide audience, obviously. So how do we do that? There is military lingo, which is obviously used by most, if not all, military members. And however, this military lingo is not necessarily accessible by the common public. So what we need to do, what I always recommend my authors do, is explain acronyms. The first time they come around, explain the acronyms, write out the words, and then put the acronym in parentheses. And afterwards, just keep on using the acronym. But at the end of the book, offer a glossary. It's something as easy as that. But that also
makes sense.
makes a good book.
Yeah, it just makes it that bit more accessible to people, doesn't it?
Because
Yeah.
you're right about the language. I mean, sometimes I even read mass market paperback thrillers, and they've got language in there, and if it's the best authors, the most accomplished authors, are those who, or either they or their editors, have taken care to make sure to remember who their audience is, because otherwise it just becomes too niche, and it's such
Right.
an easy, it's such an obvious fix to a specialist editor like you, but might not be to the author, who's just, that's just normal standard language for them.
Exactly. Yes. And also something else that I've noticed is lately I've been receiving I've been helping many authors who want to talk about their experience in the Vietnam War, because with the Vietnam War, when they came back here in the United States, many military members and veterans were not received positively,
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
or were received as positively as veterans of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq are
yeah,
being received.
Hmm.
yes,
Um, so now there is something in the community, in the American community and society, has shifted towards the Vietnam veterans, and they have become not only more acceptable but so much more supportive. So Vietnam War veterans now are feeling free to share their stories. But the issue we run into with those stories now is that certain words that were part of the common vocabulary back when the Vietnam War was happening are no longer accepted
yes,
as
All right,
words.
of course. Yeah.
So many of my authors usually ask me, well, can I say that word that we used to use because that's what will make my story authentic?
mm,
If
Hmm.
I cover it up with a word that is instead used now, it wouldn't be authentic. I would feel like I was censoring too much. So, what
Hmm.
I usually tell them to do, and it also a lot depends on the publishing company they go with, but what we usually do is we simply put a disclaimer at the very beginning of the book saying some of the language used in this book is not meant to be offensive or derogatory as it's understood today, but it's simply meant to be an authentic representation of the language used
yeah,
back during the Vietnam War.
Yeah, I
Um,
think that's
I
and
think
then,
really
that's,
important.
yeah,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
because it is important to represent those voices as they were, but you also want to, that's good when the author's acknowledging that times have changed, that language has changed, that uh standards of offence have altered, and so that's a good solution. I think it's an honest approach to it, um and then at
yes,
least the reader's warned as well. So
exactly.
yeah.
Mm.
So I've got a couple of questions for you. I probably should have asked you them separately, but I'll ask you them together. So the first thing is why you think that military stories are so important, and then I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more specifically about a really important book you wrote for children.
Yes. So, in my opinion, military stories are so important because they're the easiest ones to get lost to history amnesia, to what I call history amnesia.
Mhm.
Um, History books are written usually by people who never experienced those historical events firsthand.
Yeah.
But
Mm.
our military members have made history happen. During the Vietnam War, they know exactly what happened because they were there. They were physically present and they made history happen. But the history books that their children or grandchildren studied were not necessarily written by people who had gone to Vietnam
Mm,
and fought for the country.
mm,
So I believe in the importance of military books because I never want their stories to be lost to history
mm,
amnesia. And in the United States of America, the military members represent the 1% of the American population. So, because of that, every story of each and every military member and their family members, in my opinion, count more than anything else because
mm.
they're so incredibly unique. The
Yes.
challenges that we face as military families are unique to our own our own world, our
Yeah.
own
Yeah.
environment. And because of that, we are the only ones who can report on them
Yeah.
from, again, this goes back to what's important in a military story. What's important is being honest. And we are the only ones who can tell you exactly what's happening or what happened.
And you know what else? There's something else there because a lot of history books written by academics can be politicized and which can mask the truth. And I was reminded of this when my husband's British, but he was born in Belgium and he lived in Belgium until he was 15. And he told me that he was really shocked when he arrived in England as a 15-year-old and went to school and was studying history and realized that the accounts of some of the history, the sort of more recent history, like World War II history, were slightly different, had a slightly different bent to them because they were written by British academics rather than French academics. And so that's why it's so important, as you said, to get these individual stories, like the people who were there, not the politics, not the academics, the people who were there experiencing this stuff, because that's where the truth lies.
Yes. And as far as my book for military children, in 2017, I was contacted by the then chairman of the National Academy of Neuropsychology Foundation, Dr. Jared Fisher, who wanted to hire me as a ghostwriter because he had this idea of writing a children's book catering exclusively to military children, explaining what traumatic brain injury is, how it affects the military parent who suffers from it, and what actually happens to the brain of the affected military member so that children could then understand the consequences of traumatic brain injury, which are mainly personality changes. So, for example, a once very patient, happy-go-lucky parent and mentally, emotionally present parent suddenly comes back from deployment. The scars are gone, but
Hmm.
the
Yeah.
unfortunately the mental and the personality has changed.
Mm-hmm.
And children, what they do, the first thing that they do is they feel guilty and they think
Yeah.
this was my fault. Daddy or mommy is no longer patient or lost their patience with me and yelled at me because perhaps I should have eaten more vegetables during dinner, or perhaps I should have done better during my homework, or maybe I should have cleaned my room better. So Dr. Jared Fisher wanted to write a children's book catering to military children, explaining to them it's not your fault. This is the science, exactly what happens to the brain, to the front lobe of the brain, when the military member suffers a traumatic brain injury. And as soon as I heard this proposal, I immediately told Dr. Jerry Fisher that I did not want to be a ghostwriter. I wanted to be an author.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
he
Right.
he accepted he accepted a partnership. And I found a an amazing illustrator. His name is Valerio Mazzoli. He's also from Italy, who just happens to live in Florida as well. And he's been a Disney cartoonist since the 1970s. Together, Dr. Jerry Fisher, myself, and Valerio Mazzoli, we created a team and we worked on the story where Valerio Mazzoli had the idea, our illustrator had the idea of actually creating a character for the brain, Mr. Brain, a very um, uh, a little sort of like a little cartoonish representation of a
Mm-hmm.
brain that gets into a lot of trouble and creates a lot of problems, but it was in a funny way that children could understand. And where my um, expertise as a writer came in was finding we only had about 1,000 words to work with. And obviously, when writing a children's book, every word must count.
Yep. Yep.
Mm.
So the challenge I faced was using each and every one of those 1,000 words in a way that would help children understand and comprehend what happens to mommy or daddy's brain when they suffer from a traumatic brain injury. And together, me and the other two people on our team decided that the book was going to be distributed for free to wounded warrior families here in the United States of America. But then so many organizations, military-related organizations, came on board and helped us distribute hundreds of copies across the world to all military bases.
Oh, Brunella, that's amazing.
Thank you so much. We were very happy with the results.
Tell people what it's called.
It's called My Dad Got Hurt, What Can I Do? And they can find it on Amazon, and 100% of the proceeds go immediately toward printing another copy of the book that we can then distribute to a family in need.
Oh, that's funny. We'll put a link to that book in the show notes.
Definitely. What a really worthwhile project to have worked on, Brunella. That's fantastic. Yeah. Brunella, can I ask you now, if we put our editing hats on for a minute, which style guides, are there any particular style guides that you would recommend for when you're editing military books?
Right. So here in the United States, mostly when it comes to manuscript writing, we use the Chicago Manual style, which is currently in its 18th edition. And I was able to attend Graham School at the University of Chicago last year, where I studied the ins and outs of the Chicago Manual style from the same institution that created it. My professors were actually the people who wrote the 17th edition. So I was very lucky to be able to ask direct questions to the people who wrote the over 1,000 pages of the manual.
And just to say that people over here love that too. I love it. I mean, I just ignore the stuff that's if it's US style and I need to tweak it a bit, but it's very popular on this side of the pond.
It's incredibly comprehensive. That's why it's so useful to us. Yeah, fantastic. Any specific other specific style guides that you use for military work?
Yes. So in the Chicago Manual style, there are specific sections dedicated to editing military books. And I obviously, during the course of our classes and entire certificate courses, we couldn't study every single section section at the Graham School. But what I did, I went back to the manual and I studied the specific sections covering military lingo. Also, for example, what to use italics for in, say, the name of a ship. Should it be on USS or should it be only on the name of the ship that comes after USS? What to capitalize, where to put a dot, so on and so forth.
Yeah, these little details are important, aren't they?
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
So, can you talk now a little bit about what issues that authors of military books tend to come unstuck with over and over, like the most common things?
Right. Well, when it comes to every genre, honestly, of military books, but especially nonfiction books, and in that, especially memoirs, unfortunately, the main issue that many authors face, aside from what we've already mentioned, the emotional toll that it takes on so many authors when it comes to have to relive those tragic moments, once they go through that and they finally have a solid and professionally edited manuscript that they can then present to literary agents, the main issue they find is a no thank you reply from the agent to their query letter. And that is because the traditional publishing industry currently is saturated with, or so they say, with stories of veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan. So here are my authors who have gone through so much emotionally, mentally, and also financially, because when they hire me as their editor or as their ghostwriter, it is an investment that they're making. It is not something that they can take lightly. And finally, they are almost at the finish line, and they find this wall by the traditional publishing industry that unfortunately the market is saturated and they can no longer accept memoirs to publish memoirs. So they come back and they ask me, what can we do at this point? Fortunately for us, we have so many other publishing routes that we can follow that do not necessarily mean self-publishing, because that's a whole world on its own, and so many difficulties when it comes to self-publishing. Fortunately for us, other publishing routes seem to be a bit more receptive when it comes to military stories. For example, Brown Books Publishing Group has recently opened an entire military division to their imprint. And it's fantastic because they contacted me and talked to me about the importance of military books and what I thought. Come to find out that the owner and founder, as well as the president, are both come from military families. So they felt it deep in their heart that it was the right thing to do to create an entire military division. So now here we have the number one independent publisher in the country opening an entire military division to their publishing firm. Or we have small presses that are exclusively publishing military books, regardless of genre. Or also for those who cannot, again, make an investment into their own book, there is always the self-publishing route, which Amazon has made a bit easier to navigate.
Yeah, definitely.
Brunella, for authors who don't have a military background but are, are keen to write, perhaps fiction with in a military setting, do you recommend any particular resources that these authors could use to perhaps to do their own research or to fact check? Do you have any go-to resources that you could recommend to our listeners?
I think the most important resource that any non-military authors can rely on is veterans.
Right.
There are so many veterans who would be more than happy to help if they need a detail of an airplane, say a B-29, for example, during World War II. I know that currently veterans of World War II are close to turning 100 years old. But for example, one of my latest authors just turned 100 years old, and he is a World War II veteran. He fought in Japan. He was a prisoner of war in Japan. And he recently decided, I want to tell my story. And I helped him through the process. So, and he seems to have way more energy than I do. It's probably due to the fact that I have my two children around all day. But he, just like him, so many other veterans are more than happy to cooperate. And I think that, just like we were saying at the beginning, history books sometimes are not necessarily written by people who lived through the experience, or they might be misleading due to their political views. And what better resource to have than going directly to the source of a military veteran who has gone through it and who can tell you exactly the smallest detail on a uniform.
That's great advice. Thank you for that. Brunella, I have one last question for you. Is there anything that you do differently when you're editing, say, fiction as opposed to non-fiction? I know that some editors find it quite difficult to shift from one to the other. I do, which is why I've kind of specialized. Whereas some people find it easy to swap hats. What's your experience?
I love swapping hats. The best thing about it, I feel that with every manuscript, it feels like it's always a new date. It's almost like going on a new date. There's that thrill, that adrenaline of meeting new characters, whether in a nonfiction or a fiction setting. And it's exhilarating to me. I love being able to work across all genres. For example, I can work on a children's book, but I can also work on a memoir, self-help, and so forth, complete fiction, science fiction, or fantasy. And the main difference that obviously as an expert in the Chicago manual style, as an editor who's an expert in the Chicago manual style, what I do is there are certain liberties that I allow fiction authors to take as opposed to nonfiction authors.
Yeah.
For example, when it comes to even the smallest detail of, say, capitalizing the word general before before the last name. In nonfiction, that's a rule. The word general must be capitalized before the last name. However, it needs to not be capitalized if the last name is not present.
Yeah.
So if it stands on its own, it cannot be capitalized.
Yeah.
But when it comes to my fiction authors, I allow them a little bit more freedom with those tiny details because it is fiction and because it depends a lot on how much power the character gives that word. It's a little bit less technical, a little bit more freedom.
Yep. That flexibility is, I think, a really good thing that all fiction editors have to be aware of. But that's interesting that you also talked not just in terms of flexibility, but also in terms of the power that you give a word by how you treat it. And that's perhaps something that less experienced fiction editors might not have thought of for the military genre books. So thanks for raising that. It's great.
Of course.
Yeah. Brunella, thank you so much for
Yes.
joining us on the podcast today. It's been fascinating.
It really has.
Yeah, and I know it will have given our listeners plenty of food for thought. And you've given us some fantastic ideas and resources that we'll make sure we link to in the show notes, along with all the information about you. So now it's time for Editing Bites, which is the regular bit of the show where we each recommend a favourite resource that we think you'll find useful. So for all you military enthusiasts out there who maybe don't have a military background, my bite this week is Louise's free ebook, which is called The Art of Firearms in Fiction. This is 45 pages on writing about firearms, and it features a soldier turned editor, Steve Allen.
Yeah.
So that's my little tip.
I should just say I didn't have any hand in writing this. He offered after he'd seen something else I'd written, and again it's sort of really relevant actually because it's precisely because he's got that experience. He's been it, lived it. He knows which guns can take suppressors and what sound they make or don't make, and so he was the perfect person to do this. I couldn't have written this.
No.
So my editing bite is Val McDermid's Forensics, The Anatomy of Crime, published by the Wellcome collection in 2015. So it looks at the history of forensics from its beginnings to today's cutting edge science. And the cover's a bit gross, but especially if you're not a fan of flies. But McDermid's such a compelling speaker and writer.
She is, yeah.
You and I have both seen her speak, haven't we?
Yep, yeah.
So if you're including forensics in your novel, then it's a great resource.
That's a really good one. Yeah. I could listen to Val McDermid all day. Yeah. So that's it for this week. We hope you've enjoyed this podcast. Thank you once again to Brunella for joining us. And thank you so much for listening to the Editing Podcast. You can rate, review and subscribe to us via Apple Podcasts, Spotify or whichever platform you prefer.
Yeah, and I want to extend my final thanks to Brunella too. Thank you for coming on and talking to us.
Thank you both for having me. Thank you so much.
And we'll put all the links we've mentioned in the show notes. Take care now. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.